good evening, and welcome to a journey back through time, back to a week when winter itself seemed to hold its breath, then exhale with a fury that silenced an entire region of America. Tonight, we're going to drift together into January 1978, into the heart of the Midwest, where snow didn't just fall, it conquered. Where wind didn't merely blow, it rewrote the rules of daily life. You might be settling in after a long day, or perhaps you're lying in the quiet dark of your room, searching for something to ease your mind into rest. Whatever brings you here, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time drifting backward with me into a winter that most of us only know through photographs and faded news reports. This is epic, boring history, where we don't chase excitement, we let calmness unfold, detail by detail, until the weight of the present world lifts just enough for sleep to find you. Before we step fully into this quiet journey through the frozen days of 1978, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you're ready to wander back through time with me tonight, perhaps you could tap that like button. It's a gentle way of letting me know you're here, present in this moment of shared exploration. Consider subscribing to Epic Boring History, so these late-night passages through forgotten moments will always find their way to you when sleep feels distant and your mind seeks refuge in the past. I'd love to know where you are right now. Leave a comment telling me your location and what time it is as you listen. Some of you might be awake in the deep stillness of night, others perhaps just beginning your morning with coffee and quiet light, and still others somewhere in that in-between space where day hasn't quite decided what it wants to be. Wherever you are, you're part of this moment, this collective drift backward into history's embrace. Now, if you can, dim the lights around you. Maybe turn on a fan or open a window just slightly, letting that soft background hum of moving air create a cocoon of sound around you. Let your shoulders drop, your breathing slow, and prepare yourself for a different kind of cold, the cold of a winter that redrew maps, that stopped economies, that made the modern world remember how fragile its grip on nature truly is. We're going back to January 1978, to the great blizzard that buried the Midwest under snow so deep that highways became abstract concepts, that turned cities into silent white labyrinths, that froze an economy worth billions, and reminded America that weather, not politics or money, still held ultimate authority over human plans. This wasn't just a snowstorm, it was a pause button pressed on civilization itself, a week-long meditation on helplessness, endurance, and the strange beauty of total stillness. So breathe slowly now and let yourself settle. The past is patient. It waits for us in that space between waking and sleeping, where history becomes something we can almost touch, almost feel against our skin like wind-driven snow. Tonight, we'll experience what it meant to live through that week, not as spectators, but as participants in a collective moment of surrender to forces far beyond human control. Let's begin. You wake in the dark, as you always do on weekday mornings, to the mechanical insistence of your alarm clock, that tinny, persistent ringing that pulls you from whatever dream had been unfolding in your sleeping mind. The bedroom is cold, properly cold, the kind that makes you reluctant to emerge from the nest of blankets you've constructed through the night. Your window, when you finally force yourself to look, is etched with frost in intricate patterns, ferns and spirals that nature has painted across the glass while you slept. Beyond that crystalline barrier, you can see the street lamp at the corner of your block, casting its orange glow onto what looks like fresh snow. Just a few inches, maybe, nothing unusual for January in Ohio. The weatherman had warned of a storm coming, but then weathermen always warn of storms in winter. You've learned not to panic at every prediction, not to rush to the grocery store with everyone else, stripping the bread aisle bare before a single flake has fallen. This is the Midwest in winter. Snow is the language the sky speaks, and you've learned to be fluent in its vocabulary of inconvenience. You move through your morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who's done this 10,000 times before. The coffee percolates on the stove while you dress in layers, undershirt, work shirt, sweater, the routine armor against January's bite. The furnace in the basement hums its steady song, that ancient oil-burning beast that keeps the cold at bay, that costs more each year to feed but remains irreplaceable. Your spouse is already up, has been for 20 minutes, preparing lunches for the kids who still sleep in their rooms, innocent of the day ahead. You exchange the quiet words of people who've shared a life long enough that efficiency has replaced elaborate communication. "Roads look okay?" you ask. "For now," comes the reply, which tells you everything you need to know. The radio plays from its perch on top of the refrigerator, that familiar morning voice cycling through news and weather between advertisements for winter tire sales and furnace maintenance. The forecast has changed overnight. What was supposed to be a few inches has become possibly 6, possibly 8. They're using words like winter storm watch and travel advisory, but these phrases have lost their urgency through overuse. You eat your breakfast standing at the counter, looking out the kitchen window at a world that's beginning to blur. The snow that seemed gentle an hour ago has intensified, falling with more purpose now, more determination. The wind, which had been absent at dawn, has started to announce itself. You can hear it testing the corners of the house, seeking entry through invisible gaps in your home's defenses. Your oldest child appears in the doorway, already dressed for school, asking the question you've been avoiding. Do you think school will be cancelled? There's hope in that question, the universal childhood prayer for unexpected freedom. You tell them probably not, that it's not bad enough yet, though something in your gut suggests otherwise. By the time you're ready to leave for work, the world outside has transformed. What was a light snowfall 90 minutes ago has become something else entirely. A white curtain drawn across reality, obscuring the familiar landmarks of your street. Your car, parked in the driveway, has become a vague shape, a snow-covered sculpture of itself. You bundle into your coat, your boots, your gloves and hat, and push open the front door. The wind hits you immediately, a physical force that makes you stagger slightly, that carries snow horizontally into your face with stinging precision. This is different from the gentle snow you saw at dawn. This is aggressive, purposeful, angry. The walk to your car is only 20 feet, but it feels like crossing a frozen desert. Snow is already knee-deep in places where the wind has sculpted it into drifts, and more is falling faster than you can track individual flakes. You reach your car and begin the ritual of winter survival, scraping ice from windows, brushing snow from the hood and roof, clearing the exhaust pipe because you've heard the stories of people who didn't, who fell asleep in idling cars and never woke. The engine turns over reluctantly, coughing and protesting, before settling into an uneven idle. You let it warm while you finish clearing the windows, though the snow is replacing itself almost as quickly as you remove it. The temperature has dropped. You can feel it in the quality of the air, in the way your breath freezes immediately into tiny ice crystals that catch the dim morning light. You're backing out of the driveway when your neighbor appears, a dark figure in the white chaos, waving his arms to get your attention. He's shouting something you can't hear over the wind, gesturing toward the street. You roll down your window and immediately regret it. Snow rushes in like it's been waiting for the invitation. "Road's already impassable down by the church," he yells. "Jerry tried to get through, slid right into the ditch. Nobody's going anywhere today." You nod, roll up the window, and sit there for a moment, engine running, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the accumulating snow. The decision makes itself. You put the car back in the driveway, shut off the engine, and make your way back to the house. Inside, your family looks up with varying expressions as you reappear, snow-covered and defeated. "Home for the day," you announce, and your children's faces light up with that unearned joy of unexpected holiday. You call your supervisor, waiting through 6 rings before someone answers, and learn that the factory is closing for the day, that no one is expected in, that this decision should have been made hours ago. The phone rings constantly that morning. School districts announcing closures, friends checking on each other, relatives calling from warmer states where this kind of weather exists only in imagination. Each conversation contains the same notes of disbelief and growing concern. This isn't normal snow, everyone can feel it. That sense that something has shifted, that nature has decided to assert itself in ways that modern convenience wasn't designed to accommodate. By noon, you can no longer see across the street. Your house has become an island in a white ocean, all familiar landmarks erased by the storm's persistent rewriting of the visible world. The snow isn't just falling anymore, it's moving horizontally, driven by wind that howls around corners and finds every crack, every gap in your home's defenses. The power flickers once, twice, 3 times. Each flicker sends a spike of anxiety through your chest because you know what comes next, what always comes next in situations like this. You find flashlights, test batteries, locate candles, and matches. Your spouse fills pots and pans with water from the tap while the electricity still flows, while the well pump still works, while the illusion of modern invincibility still holds. The house groans under the wind's assault, creaking in ways you've never heard before. The windows rattle in their frames despite the storm windows you installed last fall. Outside, you can hear objects moving, trash cans, lawn furniture you forgot to secure, tree branches cracking under the weight of accumulating ice. The soundscape of the storm is constant and varied. Wind roaring, snow hissing against glass, the house itself protesting this siege. Your children, initially delighted by the unexpected day off, have grown quieter as the morning progresses. They sense the adult tension, the way conversations drop to whispers when they enter a room, the frequent glances toward windows that reveal nothing but white chaos. You try to maintain normalcy, suggesting board games, offering to bake cookies, turning on the television to cartoons that feel absurdly bright and cheerful against the monochrome reality outside. The power goes out at 1:47 in the afternoon. You note the time automatically, marking the moment when your home's connection to the larger grid severs, when you become truly isolated. The television dies mid-sentence, the refrigerator's constant hum ceases, and suddenly the house is much quieter, despite the wind's continued assault. The only sound is natural, wind and the creaking protests of a structure never designed for this magnitude of meteorological violence. You had prepared for this, but preparation exists only in theory until tested by reality. The flashlights work, casting weak circles of light that emphasize how dark the house has become. The temperature, which had been maintained at a comfortable 68 degrees by the faithful furnace, begins its slow, inevitable decline. You can't feel it yet, but you know it's happening. Heat escaping through insulation that's good but not perfect, through windows that are thermal barriers but not thermal eliminators. The fireplace becomes the center of your universe. You'd kept it clean, maintained, more for ambience than necessity, but now it transforms into your primary defense against the cold. You light a fire with wood you'd stacked in the garage last fall, and the flames feel less like comfort and more like survival. The circle of warmth extends perhaps 6 feet from the hearth. Beyond that, the house begins its transition into a refrigerator. You move essential items into the living room: blankets, pillows, food that doesn't require cooking, the battery-powered radio that becomes your only connection to the world beyond your walls. The radio speaks in scratchy bursts of information. Roads closed, power outages affecting hundreds of thousands, emergency services suspended, stay inside, stay warm, stay alive. Between announcements, static roars like a small echo of the wind outside. The afternoon blurs into evening without the usual markers of passing time. Without electric lights, the house darkens gradually, naturally, in the way human dwellings darkened for thousands of years before Edison. You eat a cold dinner by candlelight, not romantic, just necessary, and gather your family around the fireplace as darkness completes its claim on the house. Your youngest asks if you're going to die, and the question hangs in the air like smoke. You reassure them with confidence you don't entirely feel, explaining that people live through snowstorms all the time, that the house is solid, that you have food and water and each other. The words sound hollow even as you speak them, because you can feel the cold advancing, can sense the house's losing battle against the storm's siege. Night brings a strange intensification of isolation. The wind continues its assault, but in darkness the sounds become more ominous, less explicable. Something metallic is banging rhythmically somewhere, shutters maybe, or a gate you forgot to secure, and the sound becomes maddening in its persistence. You venture to a window, press your face against the icy glass, and see absolutely nothing. Just black and white chaos, snow illuminated by nothing, moving in patterns that seem almost alive. You sleep in shifts, someone always awake to tend the fire, to ensure that flames don't die and leave you vulnerable to the cold that presses against every wall. The floor is hard despite blankets and pillows, and sleep comes in fractured pieces, interrupted by wind gusts that sound like explosions, by children whimpering in uneasy dreams, by your own anxiety that surfaces every time you wake to darkness and cold. The second day begins without fanfare, without the usual rituals of mourning. You wake stiff and uncomfortable on the living room floor, the fire reduced to embers that need immediate attention. Outside, grey light reveals a world completely transformed. Snow has buried everything familiar, has created an alien landscape of white hills and valleys where your front yard used to be. The house is truly cold now, cold enough that you can see your breath, that water left in glasses overnight has a thin skin of ice. You layer clothing, everything you own practically, creating insulation from cotton and wool and synthetic fibers. Your children look like small, cloth-wrapped bundles, their faces peering out from cocoons of jackets and scarves and blankets worn like capes. Breakfast is crackers and peanut butter, eaten without enthusiasm, but with the practical understanding that your body needs fuel to generate warmth. The refrigerator has become an expensive cupboard. Without power, the food inside is simply cold storage, though the whole house is cold storage now. You've moved perishables outside, burying them in snow where they'll freeze solid, where the storm itself becomes your preservation system. The radio reports worsening conditions. The storm has stalled, has become stationary over the Midwest, has decided to empty itself completely before moving on. Snowfall rates are exceeding 2 inches per hour in some locations. Winds are gusting to 70 miles per hour. The National Guard has been activated but can't move because even their vehicles are defeated by the snow. Helicopters can't fly. The world has stopped functioning, has become a collection of isolated pockets of people waiting for nature to exhaust itself. You try to read to pass the time, but concentration is impossible when you're cold and worried and listening constantly for changes in the wind's tone. Your spouse suggests a card game, and you play a few hands before everyone loses interest, before the pretense of normalcy becomes too exhausting to maintain. The children argue over nothing, that special kind of bickering that emerges when people are confined too long in too small a space. The temperature inside the house continues its decline. The fireplace, faithful though it is, can only heat one room, and even that heating is uneven, hot near the flames, frigid near the walls. You wear gloves inside now, even while sitting near the fire, and you've given up on keeping your feet warm. They're numb most of the time, that deep ache of cold that no amount of wool sock seems to address. You venture to the front door, thinking you might shovel a path, might reassert some control over your environment. The door won't open. Snow has drifted against it, has created a wall of white that blocks your exit. You try the back door with the same result. You are trapped not by locks but by nature, by the simple accumulation of frozen water that has made your home a prison. The windows offer no comfort, only variations of the same view. White chaos, movement without progress, snow falling and blowing in quantities that seem impossible. Drifts have reached the second-story windows in places where the wind has sculpted them. Your car is no longer visible. It's become part of the landscape, another snow-covered mound indistinguishable from everything else. The third day blurs into the second without meaningful distinction. Time has become elastic, measured not in hours but in wood burned, in candles consumed, in the slow crawl of discomfort towards something approaching desperation. The fire never stops. Feeding it has become the central ritual of existence, the task around which all other tasks orbit. You're rationing water now, though you have plenty buried under snow. The effort required to melt snow for drinking has taught you efficiency. You can't waste fuel heating water for washing, for any purpose beyond survival. You smell of smoke and unwashed humanity, but so does everyone, and the olfactory offense becomes just another component of the new normal. The radio continues its litany of crisis, death toll rising, hospitals overwhelmed, people dying of heart attacks from shoveling, of hypothermia in their homes, of carbon monoxide from desperate heating attempts. Each tragedy is announced in the same measured tone, as if normalizing horror through presentation. You turn it off eventually, unable to bear the steady drumbeat of other people's catastrophes while living through your own. Your children have grown eerily quiet, past the point of complaining, settled into a kind of resigned endurance. They sleep most of the time, conserving energy, wrapped together under every blanket you own. You watch them and feel a complex mixture of protectiveness and helplessness. You can keep them safe from the storm, but you can't make them comfortable, can't restore the world that existed 4 days ago. The fourth day brings a subtle change. The wind begins to ease, its constant roar diminishing to something less apocalyptic. The snow is still falling, but slower now, as if the storm is finally exhausting its ammunition. Hope is premature, you've learned that, but you feel it anyway, that small ember of optimism that maybe this ordeal is approaching its conclusion. You manage to open the back door using a combination of force and shovel work and step out into a world rendered unrecognizable. The snow is chest-deep in the shallowest places over your head where drifts have accumulated. The effort of moving through it is immediately exhausting. Each step requires lifting your leg completely free of the snow, then plunging it forward, then repeating. 20 feet leaves you breathless and sweating despite the bitter cold. The sky is still overcast, still threatening but lighter somehow. The grey is less oppressive, suggests the possibility of clearing. You can see farther now, perhaps 100 yards instead of 10, and what you see is a landscape of pure white, punctuated by occasional dark shapes, houses, trees, telephone poles, all reduced to abstract forms by the snow's patient burial. There's no one else visible, no movement except snow still falling and wind still rearranging the accumulated drifts. Your neighborhood has become a ghost town, everyone isolated in their homes, everyone engaged in their own private battles with cold and boredom and mounting anxiety. You wonder who else is looking out, who else is seeing this strange new world and wondering when the old one will return. You dig a path to your propane tank, motivated by fear that it's running low, that your one source of cooking fuel might be exhausted. The work is brutal, the snow is heavy and wet in some layers, light and powdery in others, and moving it requires muscles you forgot you possessed. Every few minutes you stop, gasping, your heart pounding, your back screaming protest. The tank, when you finally reach it, shows half full, enough for another week, maybe more if you're careful. Back inside, you're soaked with sweat under your layers, and the transition from hot exertion to cold inactivity brings violent shivering. You change into dry clothes, precious dry clothes from your dwindling supply, and huddle near the fire until your body temperature stabilizes. The effort has cost you, your hands are raw, despite gloves, your face wind-burned, despite the scarf, your energy depleted, despite the necessity of conservation. The fifth day begins with a sight that seems miraculous. Blue sky, visible through breaking clouds, actual sunlight striking snow and transforming it into a field of diamonds. The beauty is almost painful in its intensity, this sudden reminder that the world contains more than grey and white, more than wind and cold. You stand at the window with tears in your eyes, though whether from relief or exhaustion or simple sensory overload, you can't quite say. The radio reports that the worst has passed, that the storm has finally moved on, that recovery efforts are beginning, though they'll take days or weeks. Roads remain impassable, power restoration will take time, but the active emergency has ended. You've survived, all of you have survived, though the victory feels hollow when measured against the exhaustion and discomfort of the past 5 days. Neighbors emerge like creatures from hibernation, dark figures moving slowly through chest-deep snow, checking on each other, sharing whatever resources remain. Someone has a chainsaw and begins clearing fallen trees. Someone else has a camp stove and offers hot coffee, that magical restoration of normalcy in a cup. You gather in small groups, stamping your feet and comparing experiences, and discover that your ordeal was universal. Everyone froze, everyone rationed, everyone wondered if modern civilization had been a temporary illusion. The digging begins in earnest, driveways, sidewalks, paths between houses, though the task seems impossible given the snow's depth and weight. You work until your muscles scream, then rest, then work again. Slowly, incrementally, order begins to emerge from chaos. A path appears where none existed. A street becomes barely passable for someone determined enough to risk it. The power returns on the 6th day, not everywhere but in sections, rolling restoration as crews work through the damage. When your lights flicker on, when the furnace coughs to life and begins its familiar song, you almost don't believe it. Heat flows from vents, that forced air blessing that you'd taken for granted before this week. The thermostat reads 47 degrees inside. You'd been living in a walk-in freezer without realizing how cold it had become. The refrigerator hums its return to service. The television springs to life, showing images of devastation from across the region. The water runs freely from taps once the pipes thaw. Each restored convenience feels like a minor miracle, a gift you hadn't fully appreciated before it was taken away. You stand in the hot shower until the tank runs cold, washing away 6 days of smoke and fear and forced stoicism. Life doesn't return to normal immediately. Schools remain closed, businesses struggle to reopen, supply chains are disrupted for weeks. But the acute phase has ended. The survival mode has given way to recovery mode. You return to work eventually, driving on streets barely cleared, past houses still buried, past cars that won't be recovered until spring. The storm has left its mark on everything. Physical damage, yes, but also something harder to quantify. You find yourself changed in small ways, more grateful for heat and light, more aware of infrastructure's fragility, more respectful of winter's power. You've seen what happens when the thin veneer of modernity is stripped away, when humans are reduced to their essential needs, warmth, food, water, shelter. The experience has been humbling in ways that linger long after the snow melts. Months later, you'll still think about those days, the sound of wind against windows, the desperate rationing of firewood, the fear that flickered behind your spouse's eyes when you thought the children weren't looking. The storm becomes a marker, a division between before and after, a shared trauma that bonds everyone who lived through it. When people mention winter now, your mind goes immediately to January 1978, to the week when snow stopped the world and cold became the only reality. You've learned that comfort is temporary, that security is an illusion maintained by complex systems, that nature doesn't care about your schedule or your plans or your assumption of invincibility. The lesson has made you both more anxious and more resilient. Anxious because you know how quickly things can fall apart. Resilient because you know you can survive when they do. The storm has taught you to read the sky differently, to take warnings seriously, to maintain supplies you'd have previously considered paranoid. You've become that person who checks the weather compulsively in winter, who keeps extra batteries and candles, who never lets the car's gas tank drop below half. The experience has written itself into your behavior, has changed you in ways that will persist until memory itself fades. But there's also something else, a strange nostalgia for those days, however difficult they were. You remember the family gathered around the fireplace, united by necessity, stripped of all distractions. You remember the silence after the wind stopped, the profound quiet of a world without motors or electricity or any human sound beyond breathing and heartbeat. You remember the way your neighborhood came together afterward, how people helped each other without hesitation or calculation. The storm was terrible, yes, but it was also clarifying, revealing what mattered and what didn't, who you were beneath comfort's soft disguise. You wouldn't choose to repeat it, wouldn't wish it on anyone, but neither can you entirely regret its lessons. It made you smaller, humbled by forces beyond control, and somehow larger, capable of endurance you hadn't known you possessed. The snow eventually melted, as snow always does. Spring came, green pushing through brown, the world renewing itself as if that white week had been a dream rather than lived reality. But you carry it with you still, that memory of cold and wind and helpless waiting. It surfaces every winter, every time snow begins to fall with determination, every time the weatherman uses words like historic and unprecedented. You are different now, marked by that week in ways both visible and invisible. You've touched the edge of what humans can endure, have seen the fragile membrane between civilization and chaos. The knowledge sits quiet inside you most of the time, but it's always there, a reminder that the world is wilder than it seems, that nature still holds power beyond human taming, that winter, when it chooses, can still freeze everything still. In a small office building in Cleveland, Ohio, a young meteorologist named David sits hunched over charts and data streams in the pre-dawn darkness of January 25th, 1978. His shift started at midnight, the quiet hours when weather happens, mostly without witness, when storms build over dark oceans or empty prairies while the human world sleeps. He's tracking a system moving in from the west, one of dozens he'll monitor this month. Nothing particularly unusual in its initial presentation. The barometric pressure readings catch his attention first, not their absolute values, but the rate of change, the speed at which pressure is dropping as the system crosses into the Great Lakes region. He rechecks his instruments, wondering if there's a calibration error because the numbers don't align with what his morning forecast had predicted. The storm is intensifying faster than any model suggested, feeding on some combination of conditions that the equations hadn't captured. David has been doing this job for 3 years, long enough to trust his instruments, but not long enough to trust his instincts when they conflict with standard procedures. The protocol is clear: issue warnings based on reliable data, avoid crying wolf, maintain public credibility through measured conservatism. But something about this system makes him uneasy, some quality in the data that whispers of escalation beyond normal parameters. He calls his supervisor at home, waking him from sleep, and describes what he's seeing. The barometric pressure has dropped to 959 millibars, a reading almost unprecedented for a storm this far inland. Wind speeds are increasing ahead of predictions, and moisture from the Gulf of Mexico is colliding with Arctic air descending from Canada in ways that suggest not just a winter storm, but something approaching a meteorological perfect storm. His supervisor, groggy but alert to the tension in David's voice, tells him to issue a winter storm watch and upgrade it to warning if conditions continue to deteriorate. The words are cautious, measured, reflecting years of experience with false alarms and public complacency. People hear winter storm and think of inconvenience, not catastrophe. They've been trained by repeated warnings that proved overblown, by predictions that delivered 6 inches instead of 12. David types out the warning, choosing his words carefully, trying to convey urgency without inducing panic. He describes anticipated snowfall amounts, wind speeds, travel dangers, all the standard language of winter weather advisories. But as he sends the message across wire services and radio networks, he knows the words are inadequate. That language designed for typical storms can't capture what he suspects is coming. By 6 in the morning, snow is falling across Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, gentle at first, the kind of snowfall that looks beautiful against streetlights, that makes the morning world soft and clean. Commuters begin their usual routines, scraping windshields, warming engines, listening to radio reports that describe a significant winter storm, but nothing catastrophic. Schools open on schedule, businesses operate normally, and the machinery of daily life continues its habitual turning. David watches the data deteriorate throughout the morning, watches as the storm's organization becomes more pronounced, as wind speeds climb and pressure continues its unprecedented drop. By 9 o'clock, he's upgraded every warning to the highest levels, has been on the phone with emergency management coordinators, has done everything within his professional power to communicate danger. But communication is only half the equation. Reception is the other half, and most people are already at work, already committed to their day's plans. The storm's intensification accelerates through mid-morning, like a feedback loop discovering its own power. Snow that had been falling at perhaps half an inch per hour increases to 2 inches per hour, then 3, while wind speeds that had been merely troublesome reach genuinely dangerous velocities. Visibility drops from poor to nearly 0, and suddenly the world outside becomes a white void where familiar landmarks disappear into curtains of wind-driven snow. Roads fill faster than plows can clear them, a losing battle that highway departments recognize almost immediately. Snowplows themselves become stuck, their massive weight and power insufficient against accumulation rates they weren't designed to handle. One by one, counties across the affected region make the decision to pull their equipment, to surrender the roads to the storm rather than risk operators' lives in increasingly futile efforts. The first calls for help begin arriving at emergency dispatch centers by 11 o'clock, motorists stranded, cars stuck in drifts, people trapped in vehicles that seemed adequate an hour ago but have become frozen prisons. Dispatchers take information, promise help that can't arrive, advise people to stay in their vehicles, run engines sparingly, avoid carbon monoxide poisoning. The advice is sound, but it's also an admission of helplessness. Emergency services can't reach you, you're alone until this passes. State police attempt rescues in the early afternoon, troopers driving four-wheel drive vehicles into increasingly impossible conditions. They manage to reach some stranded motorists, cramming cars full of shivering people, making multiple trips until even their vehicles can't continue. One trooper in Indiana will later describe the moment he realized they had to stop, that the snow was defeating even purpose-built emergency vehicles, that continuing meant becoming part of the problem rather than the solution. Governors declare states of emergency in rapid succession throughout the afternoon. Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, each declaration carrying the same message. Stay home, stay off roads, wait for conditions to improve. The National Guard is activated, mobilized to assist with rescue operations and snow removal, though their deployment is immediately hampered by the same conditions affecting everyone else. Military vehicles are more capable than civilian cars, but they're not magic. Deep enough snow stops everything. In Detroit, a nurse named Patricia makes a decision that will later earn her both commendation and criticism. Her shift at the hospital ends at 3 in the afternoon, but the storm has made travel impossible and patients need care. She calls her husband, tells him she's staying, that she can't abandon her responsibilities, even though she desperately wants to come home. Around her, other staff members make similar calculations, choosing between duty and family, between professional obligation and personal safety. The hospital becomes an island, cut off from supply chains and normal staffing rotations. The staff who stayed share the burden, working double shifts, triple shifts, sleeping in empty patient rooms when exhaustion overcomes them. They ration supplies carefully, knowing that delivery trucks can't reach them, that the insulin and medications and sterile equipment they have on hand must last until the storm breaks. Every decision carries weight it wouldn't under normal circumstances. Every calculation includes variables that shouldn't exist in modern healthcare. In rural Indiana, a truck driver named Thomas sits in his cab on Interstate 69, engine running, fuel gauge dropping slowly toward empty, and contemplates the decisions that brought him here. He'd known about the storm warnings, but had deadlines to meet, cargo to deliver, bills that wouldn't pay themselves if he delayed his route. The confidence had seemed reasonable 8 hours ago when the snow was light and roads were merely slick rather than impassable. Now he can't see 10 feet beyond his windshield, and he hasn't seen another vehicle in hours. The truck rocks occasionally in wind gusts that feel strong enough to tip it, and snow accumulates around the wheels with weight he can feel even through the vehicle's suspension. He has food, water, blankets, the basic survival kit that experienced drivers maintain, but fuel is the problem, the single resource he can't manufacture or ration indefinitely. Thomas does the math in his head, the grim calculation of hours of warmth versus hours of storm. If he runs the engine constantly, he'll exhaust his fuel in perhaps 10 hours, maybe 12 if he's lucky. If he runs it intermittently, letting the cab grow cold between cycles, he can extend that to perhaps 24 hours. The question is whether 24 hours will be enough, whether the storm will break before his fuel does, whether he'll be found before the cold becomes permanent. He's not alone in this calculation. All across the Midwest, hundreds of people are performing similar mathematics, measuring fuel against time, warmth against duration. Some will gamble and win, conserving resources perfectly to last until rescue arrives. Others will miscalculate, running engines too long or not long enough, and will be found later suffering from hypothermia or carbon monoxide poisoning. The randomness of it, the way survival becomes a matter of luck as much as preparation, will haunt investigators later when they compile statistics and reconstruct timelines. Back at the National Weather Service, David watches his predictions materialize with an accuracy he didn't want to achieve. The storm has exceeded even his revised forecasts, has become something meteorological textbooks will reference for decades. Pressure has bottomed out at 955 millibars, a reading that belongs to hurricanes, not winter storms. Wind gusts are approaching 80 miles per hour in exposed locations, creating ground blizzard conditions that would persist even if snow stopped falling entirely. He fields calls from emergency managers, from government officials, from radio stations desperate for information they can broadcast to isolated audiences. Each conversation is variations on the same theme. How long will this last? When can we resume operations? What should we tell people? David provides the data he has, carefully hedging predictions with meteorological uncertainty, but the truth is the storm has entered territory where historical precedent offers little guidance. The snow continues through the evening of January 25th and into the 26th without pause, without the typical breaks that even severe winter storms usually provide. The system has stalled over the Great Lakes, feeding on the temperature differential between frigid continental air and relatively warm lake water. It's creating its own weather now, self-sustaining through thermodynamic processes that turn the entire region into a snow-generating machine. Power grids begin failing under the accumulated weight of ice and snow on transmission lines. Utility companies had anticipated outages, had crews pre-positioned for rapid response, but the scale overwhelms their preparation. Lines are down across entire counties, substations are buried and inaccessible, and crews can't reach damage sites even when they know where problems exist. The electrical infrastructure, designed with redundancy and hardened against typical winter conditions, simply wasn't built for this magnitude of assault. In Columbus, Ohio, the power grid operator watches his system map as sections go dark in cascading failures. Each failed section increases load on remaining parts of the grid, creating a positive feedback loop toward total collapse. He makes the difficult decision to implement rolling blackouts, deliberately shutting down some areas to preserve the system as a whole. The choice will save the grid's fundamental architecture, but leaves thousands in the dark during the coldest night of the winter. Hospitals switch to generator power, that familiar rumble and vibration that signals transition from grid to backup systems. Most generators work flawlessly as designed, but some fail, poorly maintained or overwhelmed by demand. The hospitals where generators fail become crisis points within a larger crisis, medical staff trying to provide care by flashlight, trying to keep patients warm and safe without the electrical infrastructure modern medicine assumes. A farmer in rural Michigan named Robert opens his barn to neighbors as evening darkens into night, transforming livestock facilities into human shelter. The barn is cold, but less cold than individual houses losing heat, and there's safety in numbers, in shared body heat and shared resources. 23 people crowd into space meant for cattle, wrapped in blankets and sleeping bags, listening to wind howl outside, and animals shift uneasily in their stalls. Robert has a propane heater meant for livestock, and he runs it carefully, cracking the barn door for ventilation despite the cold, because he knows the danger of carbon monoxide in enclosed spaces. The heat it provides is modest, barely enough to take the edge off the cold, but it's something, a small assertion of human agency against the storm's overwhelming power. People take turns feeding the fire, maintaining the fragile warmth that separates discomfort from genuine danger. The children in the barn adapt most quickly, as children often do, finding games to play in the straw, making friends with the cows and horses who share their refuge. For them, this is adventure, an unexpected slumber party in the strangest of locations. The adults watch with a mixture of envy and anxiety, unable to share the children's innocence, too aware of how precarious their situation remains. Telephone operators continue working through the night, connecting calls when lines remain operational, taking messages when they don't. One operator in Cleveland will later estimate she handled over 1,000 calls during her shift, people checking on relatives, reporting emergencies, seeking information that no one has. Each call is a tiny human drama, a voice reaching across storm-shrouded distances to confirm that someone else still exists, that the world hasn't ended, even though it feels like it might have. The state emergency operation centers work through the night, coordinating what response remains possible. Maps on their walls show the affected region in red, marking road closures, power outages, reported emergencies. The red spreads like infection through the night, consuming the entire affected area until the maps become nearly useless. When everything is emergency, the category loses meaning. Military helicopters attempt rescue operations in the early hours of January 26th, flying in conditions that push both machines and pilots to their limits. The helicopters that do make it into the air find motorists stranded on highways, houses where people signal desperately for help, rural areas completely cut off from civilization. They land when possible, extracting the most desperate cases, but fuel and weather limit what they can accomplish. One helicopter pilot, a National Guard aviator with combat experience, will later describe the rescue flights as more dangerous than anything he experienced overseas. The visibility was nearly zero, the wind was violent and unpredictable, and snow clogged air intakes and threatened to ice rotors. They flew because people were dying, but each flight was a calculated gamble, with odds that made commanders uncomfortable. The death toll begins to climb through the night, though accurate counting is impossible when communication is sporadic and emergency services can't reach reported casualties. Heart attacks from shoveling snow, carbon monoxide poisoning from desperate heating attempts, hypothermia in stranded vehicles and failing homes, traffic accidents on ice-glazed roads. Death arrives in variety, finding vulnerabilities in the storm-stressed population. David, still at his post at the Weather Service, monitors reports filtering in from across the region and feels the weight of information he can do nothing about. He's done his job, issued warnings, provided forecasts, maintained communication channels, but warnings don't stop storms and forecasts don't save lives when people can't act on them. The helplessness is particular to his profession, this position of seeing disaster unfold with clarity but without power to intervene. By dawn on January 26th, the storm is finally beginning to ease, its fury exhausting itself after more than 30 hours of continuous assault. Snow still falls, but with less intensity, and wind that had been screaming begins to quiet to merely roaring. The change is gradual enough that people don't trust it at first, waiting for the storm to resume its attack, conditioned by the previous day's relentlessness to expect no mercy. The landscape revealed by weak morning light is almost incomprehensible in its transformation. Streets have become canyons between walls of plowed snow. Cars are buried so completely that only antennas or mirrors hint at their presence. Buildings appear shrunken, their first floors disappeared beneath drifts that reach second-story windows. The entire human geography of the region has been rewritten in white. Emergency services begin their work in earnest as conditions permit, though permit is a relative term when snow remains chest-deep and wind continues to create hazardous conditions. Snowplows emerge from maintenance yards, beginning the multi-day task of reopening roads. Emergency vehicles follow plowed routes, checking on reported stranded motorists, finding some alive and grateful, others silent in vehicles that became tombs. The National Guard deploys in tracked vehicles, the only ground transportation capable of consistent movement through snow this deep. They establish supply chains to hospitals running low on essentials, to shelters housing people displaced from homes without power or heat. The military precision brings order to chaos, though even military logistics strain under the scope of the disaster. A command center in Indianapolis coordinates the multi-state response, trying to allocate scarce resources across vast areas of need. Every decision is triage, this town before that one, this highway before that one, these stranded motorists before those. The calculus is brutal in its necessity, prioritizing many over few, strategic routes over isolated clusters, but every choice weighs on the people making them. Radio stations become lifelines, broadcasting continuously with updates on road conditions, shelter locations, emergency numbers. DJs abandon their usual programming to read community messages, families trying to reach each other, people offering help, businesses announcing closures. The stations stay on air through power failures and equipment problems, understanding that they've become essential infrastructure, that their signal is sometimes the only connection to the wider world. In the days following the storm's passage, the full scope of devastation becomes clear through thousands of individual reports, aggregating into statistical horror. Over 100 people dead across the affected states, though the exact number will never be certain. Some deaths are storm-related but indirect, heart attacks and accidents that might have happened anyway, but were enabled or complicated by conditions. Hundreds more injured in ways that will leave permanent marks: frostbite amputations, trauma from accidents, health complications from exposure. The economic toll accumulates even faster than the human one. Every closed business is revenue lost. Every delayed shipment is commerce interrupted. Every worker unable to reach their job is productivity disappeared. The factories that power the Midwest economy sit silent, their assembly lines stopped not by choice but by impossibility. The automotive industry alone will later calculate losses in the hundreds of millions, though the true figure, including downstream effects, likely exceeds $1 billion. Grocery stores, already depleted by pre-storm panic buying, can't be restocked when trucks can't move. The food supply chain, normally invisible in its efficiency, becomes a subject of anxious attention as shelves stay empty. People who had 3 days' food discover that 3 days wasn't enough, that the storm lasted longer than preparation anticipated. Neighbors share what they have, an informal redistribution network that operates on trust and necessity. The psychological impact is harder to quantify but no less real. The storm has demonstrated the fragility of systems people assumed were robust, has shown that civilization is a thin layer over natural chaos. The revelation produces different responses. Some people become more preparedness-focused, stocking food and supplies against future disasters. Others develop anxiety around winter weather, flinching at snow forecasts that previously would have seemed routine. David will continue his career as a meteorologist, but January 1978 will remain his reference point, the storm against which all others are measured. He'll write academic papers about its dynamics, will lecture about the importance of aggressive warning protocols, will argue for better modeling systems that might predict the next one. But he'll also carry the memory of watching catastrophe unfold in real time, of knowing what was coming and being unable to stop it. The Great Blizzard of 1978 will enter collective memory as one of those generational markers, an event that divides time into before and after. People will reference it for decades. Remember 78, they'll say, and everyone of a certain age will nod, will have their own story of where they were, how they survived, what they lost. The storm becomes communal property, a shared trauma that bonds those who lived through it. Insurance companies will spend months processing claims, calculating damage to property and vehicles, trying to quantify in monetary terms what the storm destroyed. The numbers they arrive at feel both enormous and insufficient. How do you price a week of terror, of cold endured, of certainty shaken? The checks they write restore property but not confidence, rebuild structures but not the sense of security that preceded the storm. Infrastructure damage takes months to fully repair. Power lines must be restrung. Roads require extensive maintenance beyond simple snow removal. Buildings damaged by ice and wind need structural work. The repair work provides employment through a winter that would otherwise be economically stagnant, an accidental stimulus that partially offsets the storm's destructive economic impact. But the work is hard and cold and dangerous, fixing in uncomfortable conditions what nature broke in fury. The meteorological analysis begins almost immediately, scientists eager to understand what produced such an exceptional event. They study the pressure readings, the wind patterns, the temperature profiles, all the data that describes the storm in numbers and charts. What they discover is a nearly perfect confluence of conditions: Arctic air, Gulf moisture, Great Lakes enhancement, atmospheric dynamics that amplified rather than dampened the system. The analysis confirms that the storm was predictable in its components, but unprecedented in their combination and intensity. Every element existed in weather records separately, but their simultaneous occurrence was so statistically unlikely that no model had weighted it properly. It's a reminder that nature operates in spaces where probability theory provides guidance but not certainty, where the improbable eventually becomes inevitable given enough time. Academic conferences in the years following will feature sessions dedicated to the blizzard, presenting papers with titles dense with technical terminology. But beneath the scientific language is a simpler question that drives the research. Could we prevent this? The answer, unsatisfying but honest, is no, we can't prevent weather, only prepare for it better. The blizzard prompts improvements in forecasting, in emergency response, in building codes and infrastructure design, but it also confirms limits that technology can't transcend. The stories that emerge from the storm become local folklore, tales told and retold with the embellishment and compression that memory applies. Some stories are heroic: the nurse who walked 5 miles through drifts to reach her hospital, the snowplow operator who worked 40 straight hours, the family who sheltered 12 neighbors in their basement. Other stories are tragic: the elderly couple found frozen in their home, the trucker who ran out of fuel, the child who wandered from their house and disappeared into white. For the people who lived through it, the blizzard of 1978 remains vivid in ways that other memories fade. They remember specific details: the sound of wind, the quality of cold, the way snow reflected streetlight into their windows. They remember decisions made under pressure, choices between bad options, moments where fortune smiled or turned away. The memories are varied, but share common threads of fear, endurance, and the strange clarity that comes from confronting elemental forces. The government response to the storm, initially praised for mobilization and coordination, becomes subject to criticism as more information emerges about delayed decisions and inadequate preparation. Some argue that warnings should have been stronger, that states should have closed roads earlier, that the National Guard should have been activated sooner. The criticism is easier in hindsight when the storm's severity is known and outcomes are visible, but it prompts genuine examination of procedures and protocols. Congressional hearings examine the federal response, the distribution of disaster relief, the coordination between state and federal agencies. Legislation emerges from these hearings, bills designed to improve emergency management systems and funding mechanisms for disaster response. The storm's legacy extends into policy, changing how government at all levels prepares for and responds to weather emergencies. The economic recovery takes longer than the physical recovery, stretching through winter into spring as businesses struggle to recoup losses. Some small businesses, already operating on thin margins, never recover. The week or two of lost revenue proves fatal to enterprises that couldn't afford the interruption. The failures ripple through communities, each closed business representing not just lost commerce, but lost employment, lost gathering places, lost pieces of community infrastructure. The agricultural impact won't be fully understood until spring planting season, when farmers discover livestock losses from the cold, equipment damage from the weight of snow and ice, and structural failures in barns and outbuildings. The death toll among cattle, pigs, and chickens numbers in the thousands, each lost animal representing income that won't materialize, product that won't reach markets. Federal agricultural disaster assistance helps, but doesn't fully compensate for losses. The winter of 1978 becomes a benchmark in the region's history, a marker against which subsequent winters are measured. People will say not since '78 when describing snowfall or cold, invoking the blizzard as the ultimate standard of winter severity. The comparison becomes almost comforting, a way of contextualizing lesser hardships by reference to that supreme difficulty. For meteorologists, the blizzard remains a case study in forecast uncertainty and communication challenges. They recognize that they correctly identified the threat, but struggled to convey its severity to a public desensitized by routine winter weather warnings. The balance between accuracy and alarmism remains difficult. How do you make people understand that this time is different, that this storm exceeds all typical parameters, without becoming the forecaster who cried wolf? David will retire from the National Weather Service decades later, having tracked countless storms through a career spanning technological revolutions in forecasting. But when asked about his most memorable day at work, he'll return to January 25th, 1978, to the night when he watched a storm exceed even his worst projections. The memory stays sharp, the pressure readings, the phone calls, the growing realization that something historically significant was unfolding. The blizzard of 1978 taught lessons about preparedness, about infrastructure resilience, about the importance of heeding warnings even when warnings are common. But perhaps its deepest lesson was simpler and older, that nature remains powerful beyond human taming, that weather doesn't negotiate with civilization, that winter, when it chooses, can still reduce the modern world to its primitive essentials. The storm was a reminder written in snow and ice, a message that remains legible decades later. We are never as safe as we believe, never as insulated from the natural world as our technology suggests. The people who survived it carry that knowledge quietly, a private understanding that surfaces every winter when snow begins to fall. They check weather forecasts more carefully, prepare more thoroughly, respect winter's potential more deeply than those who only know it through stories. The blizzard marked them, left an imprint that time hasn't erased. They are survivors of something that tested civilization and found it wanting, witnesses to a week when the modern world stopped and winter ruled absolutely. The Great Blizzard of 1978 began, as all storms do, with invisible movements of air thousands of feet above the ground, in that cold realm where weather is born before descending to trouble human affairs. The science of storms is the science of boundaries, of what happens when air masses that belong in different places meet and interact. In late January 1978, two such masses approached each other over the American Midwest, with geometries that would prove catastrophic. From the north came Arctic air, descending from polar regions where winter means something absolute, where cold is not merely uncomfortable but deadly. This air mass was dense and heavy, with cold sinking toward the Earth's surface like water seeking its level. Its temperature at ground level was measured in the negative numbers, degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, that turned exposed flesh numb in minutes, that made breath freeze in the lungs. From the south came moisture-laden air from the Gulf of Mexico, that warm body of water that pumps heat and humidity into the atmosphere even in winter. This tropical air was less dense, warmer, buoyant with water vapor that had evaporated from the Gulf's surface and been carried northward by prevailing winds. Under normal circumstances, such air masses meet along a front, create weather, and then dissipate as conditions change. But 1978's geometry was anything but normal. The collision occurred directly over the Great Lakes, those massive inland seas that represent their own meteorological factor in regional weather. The lakes, not yet frozen despite the cold January, maintained water temperatures in the 30s and 40s, cold by human standards, but warm compared to the air above them. They were ready to feed the storm, to donate moisture and energy to a system that would use both with devastating efficiency. Meteorologists have a term for what happened next: explosive cyclogenesis, the rapid intensification of a low-pressure system that transforms routine weather into catastrophic event. The process involves thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, and atmospheric physics too complex for simple explanation, but the essence is feedback. The storm creates conditions that strengthen the storm, which creates stronger conditions, in a loop that builds until some limiting factor intervenes. The barometric pressure at the storm's center dropped with stunning speed, falling from values associated with typical winter weather to readings usually seen only in major hurricanes. This pressure drop represented air literally being sucked upward in the storm's core, creating a void at the surface that surrounding air rushed to fill. That rushing air was wind, and the greater the pressure difference, the faster the wind blew. The Coriolis effect, that consequence of Earth's rotation, that shapes all large-scale atmospheric motion, organized the inflowing air into a counter-clockwise spiral. The storm became a vast circular engine, pulling in air from all directions, spinning it around a central axis, and then exhausting it outward in the upper atmosphere. The entire system was hundreds of miles across, a weather machine of continental scale. As air spiraled inward and upward, it cooled, a consequence of decreasing pressure with altitude. Cool air holds less moisture than warm air, so the water vapor began to condense, forming clouds, forming snowflakes, releasing latent heat that had been stored in the vapor. That released heat powered the system further, added energy that intensified the circulation, created more lifting, that produced more precipitation, that released more heat. The snow that fell was not uniform but varied across the storm system depending on temperature, moisture availability, and lift dynamics. Near the center, where uplift was strongest, snow fell in rates measured in inches per hour, accumulation so rapid that surfaces were buried faster than any human effort could clear them. Farther from the center, precipitation was lighter but spread across vast areas, blanketing entire states. The wind was perhaps even more significant than the snow itself, sculpting the fallen precipitation into drifts that bore little relationship to actual snowfall totals. In open areas, winds scoured snow down to bare ground, then deposited it in lee areas where drifts grew to 15, 20, even 30 feet deep. The landscape became a study in fluid dynamics, snow behaving like water, flowing around obstacles, and pooling in low spots. Ancient peoples understood storms as expressions of divine will, weather as the language through which gods communicated with humans. They were not entirely wrong. There is something transcendent about weather at this scale, something that reduces human agency to insignificance. The Native American traditions of the Great Lakes region included deep knowledge of winter's moods, practical wisdom encoded in stories about reading clouds and wind. The Ojibwe people, who inhabited the region for centuries before European arrival, had detailed terminology for different types of winter weather. They distinguished between gentle snow that accumulated slowly and violent snow that came with wind and cold. Their languages contained words for the quality of snow, wet or dry, clinging or powdery, because these qualities determined survival strategies, travel possibilities, hunting success. Traditional ecological knowledge emphasized respect for winter's power, an understanding that humans don't conquer cold, but merely endure it through preparation and humility. The stories passed through generations contained warnings about reading weather signs, about respecting the signals that nature provides. Dark bands on woolly bear caterpillars, the behavior of birds and mammals, the quality of autumn leaves, all were believed to predict winter's severity. Modern science largely dismissed this traditional knowledge as superstition, relying instead on instruments and mathematical models. But the dismissal may have been premature. Recent research suggests that some traditional weather predictors contain genuine correlation with actual conditions. Animals do respond to barometric pressure changes before storms arrive. Plants do adapt their behavior based on long-range climate signals that we're only beginning to understand. The 1978 blizzard humbled modern forecasting, even as it validated some forecasting principles. Meteorologists correctly identified that a storm was coming, correctly predicted snow and wind, but failed to convey the magnitude of what was approaching. The failure was partially technical. Models couldn't capture the storm's rapid intensification, but also communicative, a gap between knowing and effectively warning. In the storm's aftermath, some people reported experiences that bordered on the mystical, sensations of presence in the wind, feelings of communication from the weather itself. These reports were dismissed as stress responses, as psychological effects of prolonged isolation and fear. But they suggest something about how humans perceive weather at its extremes, how the rational mind grapples with forces that exceed everyday experience. The sound of the 1978 blizzard was as memorable as its visual impact, a constant roar of wind interrupted by explosive gusts that shook buildings and bent trees. Some described the sound as breathing, as if the storm were a living thing drawing and expelling air. Others compared it to machinery, to jet engines or industrial equipment running beyond designed limits. The acoustic environment was oppressive, inescapable, a sonic assault that lasted days. Inside that sound were subtler variations that attentive listeners could distinguish: the whistle of wind through power lines, the percussion of snow against windows, the creaking of structures under stress, the occasional crack of breaking tree limbs. The soundscape became a source of information and anxiety, each new sound requiring interpretation, each change in the wind's tone suggesting possible disaster. The physics of sound in blizzard conditions creates unusual acoustic phenomena. Snow absorbs sound waves, creating abnormal quiet in some circumstances, while wind carries sound farther than usual in others. People reported hearing distant sounds with unusual clarity: a train miles away, a snowplow working streets over, someone calling for help from an impossible distance. The sound inversions created by temperature gradients bent sound waves in unexpected ways. After the storm passed and silence returned, that absence of wind became itself remarkable. People spoke of the stillness as almost physical, as if the air had solidified in the wake of the storm's departure. The quiet was broken only by the distant sounds of recovery: helicopters, snowplows, human voices calling to each other across the transformed landscape. The contrast between the storm's fury and its aftermath's peace was psychologically jarring. Artifacts of the blizzard were preserved in unexpected ways, frozen moments that lasted until spring thaw revealed them. Newspapers blown from delivery tubes were found perfectly readable, sealed in ice that protected them from decay. A child's toy left in a yard was recovered months later, slightly damaged but recognizable, a time capsule of the moment before the storm. Cars abandoned on highways became archaeological sites, their interiors preserving evidence of the moments when occupants gave up on reaching their destinations. Food wrappers, coffee cups, blankets and coats, maps marked with routes that became irrelevant, all remained frozen in place until recovery crews reached them. Each vehicle told a small story of decision and circumstance, of the instant when forward progress became impossible. Buildings damaged by the storm bore marks that remained visible for years: bent metal, cracked masonry, deformed roofs where snow load exceeded structural capacity. Some communities chose to leave certain damage unrepaired, marking the buildings as monuments to the storm, physical reminders of winter's power. A collapsed barn roof, a house with storm-broken windows, a fence flattened by drifts. These became informal memorials. The storm's hydrology left traces that scientists studied for decades. The snow that fell in January 1978 represented an enormous mass of water temporarily stored in solid form. When spring came and melting began, that stored water was released over weeks, creating flooding concerns and recharging aquifers. The timing and geography of snowmelt affected agriculture, groundwater levels, and river flows through the entire growing season. Ice cores taken from the Great Lakes showed the storm's signature, a layer marking that week in January when temperatures plummeted and snow accumulated on ice surfaces. The layer contained atmospheric particulates, chemical signatures of pollution, and natural aerosols, trapped bubbles of air from January 1978. The cores became historical documents, reading in ice what the storm left behind. Weather observers noted unusual optical phenomena during and after the storm: light pillars, halos, sundogs, and other refraction effects created by ice crystals in the air. The atmosphere became a prism, bending light into patterns that seemed almost supernatural. Photographs from the period sometimes capture these effects, strange lights and shapes that make the storm scenes appear otherworldly. The psychological science of disaster includes study of how humans process and remember catastrophic events, how memory preserves and distorts experience. Survivors of the 1978 blizzard consistently report vivid memories of specific details: the color of light during the storm, the texture of wind-driven snow against skin, the particular quality of cold that penetrated layered clothing. These sensory memories persist with unusual clarity, branded into consciousness by their intensity. Memory researchers note that traumatic or highly significant events create what they call flashbulb memories, recollections that feel photographically accurate and remain stable over decades. The blizzard created such memories across an entire region, a shared experience that became part of collective identity. When survivors meet and discover they lived through it, the connection is immediate and profound. But memory is also reconstructive, colored by subsequent experience and narrative. The stories people tell about the storm change subtly over time, emphasizing different details, reorganizing events into more coherent narratives than experience provided. The gap between lived reality and remembered story is where history becomes folklore, where facts shade into meaning. The storm raised philosophical questions about humanity's relationship with nature, about the limits of technological civilization, about what happens when the natural world refuses to accommodate human schedules and expectations. These questions had been asked before. Every generation faces weather that reminds them of their vulnerability, but the 1978 blizzard posed them with particular force to a society that had come to see nature as largely managed and controlled. The environmental movement of the 1970s had already begun questioning assumptions about human dominance over nature, but the blizzard provided visceral evidence for those arguments. Here was nature demonstrating power beyond human mitigation, weather that didn't care about economic systems or political structures. The lesson was old: nature bats last, as the saying goes, but each generation must learn it anew. Indigenous knowledge systems that never abandoned respect for natural forces found themselves suddenly relevant to conversations that had previously dismissed them. The idea that weather might require not just prediction but relationship, not just modeling but humility, gained traction in discussions about climate and civilization. The blizzard became an argument for integrating traditional wisdom with modern science. The storm also demonstrated the fragility of complex systems, how interdependencies that create efficiency under normal conditions become vulnerabilities under stress. The electrical grid, the road network, the supply chain, the communication infrastructure all failed partially or completely because they were optimized for typical conditions, not extreme ones. Resilience, engineers realized, requires different design philosophy than efficiency. In the decades since 1978, climate science has provided context for that winter's extreme weather. While no single event can be attributed solely to climate change, the research suggests that atmospheric conditions capable of producing such storms may be influenced by larger climate patterns. The jet stream's position, Arctic temperatures, ocean heat content, all factors in storm generation, all potentially affected by long-term climate trends. The question becomes not whether the 1978 blizzard was caused by climate change, it predates most significant human-caused warming, but whether future storms of similar intensity become more or less likely as the climate continues to shift. The science suggests complex answers, with some extreme winter events potentially becoming rarer as winters warm, while others might intensify due to increased atmospheric moisture and altered circulation patterns. The storm's legacy in scientific literature is substantial, hundreds of papers analyzing its dynamics, its impacts, its lessons for forecasting and emergency response. The event became a benchmark, a test case against which models are validated and procedures are measured. When new forecasting techniques are developed, they're applied retrospectively to 1978 to see if they would have better predicted the storm's behavior. But beyond the scientific papers and the technical analyses, the blizzard remains a story about mystery, about how weather, despite all our instruments and equations, retains elements of unpredictability and awe. The storm was explained after the fact, its dynamics understood and documented, but in the moment of its occurrence, it was a force beyond complete comprehension, a natural phenomenon that humbled human understanding. The drifting snow became almost liquid in its behavior, flowing around obstacles, pooling in depressions, creating formations that seemed sculpted by conscious intent. The wind carved the landscape into art, ridges and curves, peaks and valleys, abstract forms of white on white that existed briefly before the next gust reshaped them. The beauty was cold and alien, fascinating in the way that dangerous things often are. In the stillness after the storm before human activity resumed, the world experienced a kind of pristine silence that may not exist anymore, that may have been erased by the omnipresent background noise of modern civilization. Those who walked out into the immediate aftermath describe it as entering another world, a place where the ordinary rules were suspended and reality had been rewritten in snow. The mystery isn't in what happened. Meteorology can explain that, but in what it meant, what it revealed about the relationship between human civilization and the natural systems it exists within. The storm was a reminder, written large across an entire region, that the world remains wild beneath its civilized surface, that winter still knows how to stop human plans and impose its own rhythms. You drift now, imagining that whiteness, that stillness, that week when the world paused and winter spoke in a voice that demanded listening. The science explains the mechanisms but not the meaning, describes the causes but not the significance. Some mysteries remain even after explanation, preserved in the gap between knowing how and knowing why. In the executive offices of automotive companies in Detroit, men in suits gathered around conference tables on January 26, 1978, watching through tall windows as snow fell over a city that had stopped functioning. The view from the 40th floor showed a landscape transformed into abstraction, familiar geography erased beneath white. These were men accustomed to commanding resources, to managing systems of production that employed hundreds of thousands, to moving metal and money in quantities that shaped regional economies. But the storm had revealed something they preferred not to acknowledge, that their power was contextual, dependent on systems functioning as designed. Without electricity to run assembly lines, without roads to move parts and products, without workers who could reach factories, the machinery of industry simply stopped. Billions of dollars of infrastructure sat idle, useless as monuments, while snow accumulated and wind howled. The economic calculation began immediately, as it always does in boardrooms where decisions are quantified in quarterly reports and shareholder value. Every hour of stopped production was revenue lost, market share potentially surrendered to competitors, commitments to dealers and customers that couldn't be met. The pressure to resume operations was enormous, encoded in contracts and financial projections and executive compensation tied to productivity metrics. But the storm refused negotiation. You cannot bargain with barometric pressure, cannot offer incentives to wind. The forces that stopped the factories were indifferent to economic arguments, to the implications for regional employment, to the cascade of consequences flowing from halted production. Nature operated on timescales and according to priorities that had nothing to do with fiscal quarters or manufacturing schedules. The paradox was sharp. The very efficiency that made the automotive industry profitable under normal conditions made it vulnerable under extraordinary ones. Just-in-time inventory systems meant minimal stockpiles of parts, which meant that even brief supply chain disruptions had immediate effects. The optimization for typical conditions created brittleness when conditions became atypical. In Chicago's financial district, trading floors that usually roared with activity felt eerily quiet as traders couldn't reach their posts. The markets that did open operated with reduced volume, uncertainty rippling through pricing as information flow became sporadic. Futures contracts for agricultural commodities showed volatility as traders tried to calculate how much winter wheat was destroyed under snow, how many cattle died in unheated barns, how spring planting might be affected by equipment damage. The storm was costing money at rates that were difficult to calculate in real time, but clearly astronomical. Wages went unpaid when work couldn't happen, which meant spending declined, which meant secondary effects cascading through an economy built on the assumption of continuous circulation. Money, it turns out, needs movement to function. Frozen in place, it becomes as useless as water frozen in pipes. Insurance companies watched their exposure grow with each report of damaged property, stranded vehicles, business interruption claims. The actuarial tables that normally predicted losses with reasonable accuracy had no category for weather events of this magnitude in this location. The storm was rewriting risk models, forcing companies to reconsider assumptions about what was possible in the Midwest's winter climate. Meanwhile, in modest homes where heat came from radiators or baseboards, where food was purchased day by day rather than stockpiled, where missed work meant missed rent, the storm's economic impact was more immediate and personal. The difference between discomfort and disaster wasn't measured in millions, but in the margin between paychecks, in the few dollars that separated adequacy from deprivation. The elite experienced the storm from positions of insulation that money and preparation could provide. Their homes had backup generators that kicked in when grid power failed, maintaining heat and light while neighbors shivered in darkness. They had stockpiles of food purchased before the storm, enough to wait out a week or two without hardship. They had the resources to treat the storm as inconvenience rather than catastrophe. But insulation is not invincibility, and even the wealthy discovered limits to what money could purchase against weather. Their generators required fuel that couldn't be delivered when roads were impassable. Their larger homes required more heating than backup systems could provide. Their positions of authority couldn't command snow to melt or wind to stop. Government officials faced the storm from their own complicated position, responsible for public safety, but limited in their capacity to provide it. Governors declared emergencies and activated National Guard units, performing the rituals of leadership that their positions required. But the declarations changed little on the ground, where people were stranded regardless of official pronouncements, where rescue depended on physical capability rather than political authority. The meetings in state capitals and county seats had a quality of performance about them, officials coordinating responses that couldn't actually be implemented until conditions improved. They issued advisories that told people to stay home, to avoid travel, to wait for assistance. Sensible advice, but essentially passive, an admission that government's active powers were suspended by the storm. The contrast with ordinary citizens' experience was stark and visible. While officials met in heated government buildings maintained by backup power, while they coordinated over phone lines that remained operational through emergency systems, the people they governed huddled around fireplaces and worried about fuel running out. The gap between governing and governed was usually abstracted by bureaucracy and distance, but the storm made it concrete and geographic. Federal response came slowly, hampered by the same conditions affecting everyone else, but also by political calculations about cost and precedent. The president was briefed on the situation, received reports from FEMA and other agencies, and faced the question that always accompanies disaster declarations: how much federal money should flow to address what was fundamentally a regional crisis? The decision-making happened in rooms far from the affected areas, in Washington offices where the storm was an abstraction visible through data and reports rather than lived experience. The officials making decisions were warm and safe, their daily routines unchanged except for additional meetings and briefings. They understood the crisis intellectually but not viscerally, knew the numbers but not the sensation of watching your breath freeze inside your own home. When federal disaster declarations finally came, they brought access to emergency funding and resources, but the help arrived on timelines determined by bureaucratic process rather than human need. Forms had to be filed, damage had to be assessed, procedures had to be followed. the machinery of government assistance designed to prevent fraud and ensure accountability moved at speeds that felt glacial to people waiting for help. The economic elite, corporate executives, major investors, large property owners, experienced the storm primarily through financial impact rather than physical hardship. Their quarterly earnings would show the damage, their stock portfolios would reflect market uncertainty, their property investments might face insurance claims. But they themselves remained largely insulated from the cold and hunger that affected the working poor. A CEO of a manufacturing company spent the storm week in his suburban mansion, heated by a system that ran on natural gas and electricity and backup generators, with enough food stockpiled to feed his family for weeks. He conducted business by phone when lines were operational, monitoring his company's losses in real time, making decisions about when to resume operations. His primary discomfort was boredom, the frustration of being unable to travel rather than inability to survive. Meanwhile, one of his factory workers spent the same week in a small rental house with failing heat, rationing food that was supposed to last 3 days but needed to stretch to 6 or 7, burning furniture in the fireplace when wood ran out. The worker's primary concern was survival, then recovery, then getting back to work to earn wages that had stopped flowing when the factory closed. The divergence of experience along class lines wasn't new. Poverty has always meant greater vulnerability to disaster, but the storm made it visible in ways that normal times obscured. When everyone claims to be struggling, the degrees of struggle become apparent. The difference between postponed luxury and deferred meals, between inconvenience and genuine suffering, was measured in resources that had seemed abstract before the storm made them concrete. The social safety net, such as it existed in 1978, was tested by the storm and found wanting in various ways. Emergency shelters opened in schools and community centers, providing warmth and food for people displaced from homes without power. But the shelters themselves relied on infrastructure that the storm had compromised: electricity, food delivery, staff who could reach them. Many operated at partial capacity, turning people away not from lack of will, but lack of capability. Welfare systems that normally provided assistance through monthly checks and food stamps found themselves unable to deliver benefits when offices were closed and mail couldn't move. People who depended on regular assistance found themselves without resources at precisely the moment they most needed them. The irony wasn't lost on advocates who had long argued that emergency systems should be designed to function during emergencies. The church and community organizations that stepped into gaps left by government and market worked from positions of limited resources but often greater flexibility. A church basement became a shelter because a pastor had keys and made a decision, bypassing the committee processes that formal systems required. A community group distributed food from donated supplies without waiting for official authorization or coordination. These informal systems saved lives and reduced suffering, but they also revealed the fragility of relying on volunteerism to address systemic needs. The pastor who opened the church hadn't slept in 3 days by the storm's end. The community organizers exhausted their personal resources and borrowed against future capacity to meet immediate demands. The help was real but unsustainable, emergency response that worked in crisis but couldn't replace institutional capacity. The storm exposed class structures that normally remained politely unexamined in American discourse. The geography of suffering followed the geography of wealth with uncomfortable precision. Neighborhoods with newer homes and better infrastructure retained power longer and restored it faster. Areas with older housing stock and aging utilities sat in darkness for days after wealthier areas were restored. The explanation was technical. Newer areas had underground power lines less vulnerable to ice damage, better insulation that retained heat longer, housing codes that required backup systems. But the technical explanation was also an economic one. Those improvements cost money that determined where they were implemented. The storm didn't create inequality but made it visible in thermodynamic terms. measurable in degrees Fahrenheit rather than income percentiles. Urban planning that had concentrated poverty in specific neighborhoods meant that emergency services, already stretched thin, faced impossible triage decisions. Should scarce snow removal resources go to main arteries that served everyone, or residential streets in poor neighborhoods where people had less capacity to cope? The utilitarian answer prioritized highways, but the human cost fell on those least able to bear it. The suburbs fared better than inner cities in most cases, their lower density and newer infrastructure providing advantages that wealth had purchased. Suburban residents could rely on multiple support systems, neighbors with similar resources, homeowners associations with emergency funds, local governments with tax bases that supported robust services. The isolation that was suburban life's drawback in normal times became an advantage when services collapsed. You could survive independently if you had resources, and suburban residents generally did. Rural areas faced different challenges, dispersed population making emergency response difficult even in good conditions. But rural residents often possessed skills and resources that urban dwellers lacked. Wood stoves instead of central heating, wells instead of municipal water, neighbors who would check on you because that's what rural life meant. The independence that rural Americans prided themselves on wasn't just ideology, but practical necessity when help lived miles away. The storm revealed that power, political, economic, social, was fundamentally about options. The wealthy had options the poor didn't: leave before the storm, stay somewhere else during it, hire help for recovery after it. The connected had options the isolated didn't: call in favors, access information, navigate bureaucracies. The difference between managing a crisis and being overwhelmed by it often came down to how many choices you had access to. For the powerful, the storm was a problem to be managed, an obstacle requiring resources and planning, but ultimately surmountable. For the powerless, it was a force to be endured, hoped through, survived without much capacity to shape outcomes. The divergence wasn't absolute. Wealthy people suffered too, and poor people found resilience and community, but the statistical patterns were clear in aggregate data that would be compiled later. Insurance claims processed after the storm showed the disparity clearly. High-value properties filed for repairs to heating systems, structural damage, lost artwork, and furniture. Low-value properties, if they were insured at all, filed for basic survival needs: replacement of ruined food, temporary housing costs, minimal repairs. The gap between insured and uninsured was itself a marker of class: those with least capacity to absorb losses, least likely to have coverage that would cushion them. The labor market's response to the storm revealed another dimension of power imbalance. Salaried employees, particularly those in white-collar positions, often received paid time during the forced closure. Their compensation continued even though work stopped. Hourly workers, especially in service and manufacturing, saw paychecks simply end when operations ceased. No work meant no wages, and no wages meant immediate financial crisis for people living check to check. Some employers chose to pay workers during the closure, absorbing the cost as a matter of fairness or employee relations. Others calculated that their obligation ended when work became impossible, that weather was an act of God that freed them from normal employment expectations. The difference often correlated with union representation. Organized labor had negotiated protections that unorganized workers lacked. The political response to the storm's economic impact followed predictable patterns, with different factions drawing different conclusions from the same events. Conservatives pointed to individual resilience and community response as evidence that government assistance was unnecessary or secondary. Liberals highlighted the suffering in poor communities as proof that social safety nets needed strengthening. Both were partly right, which made resolution impossible. The debate about federal disaster spending became a proxy for larger arguments about government's role, about individual versus collective responsibility, about whether society had obligations to its most vulnerable members beyond minimal emergency response. The storm didn't settle these arguments, no single event could, but it provided fresh evidence that all sides could interpret according to their prior commitments. Business leaders argued for rapid restoration of infrastructure to minimize economic losses, framing their interests as aligned with the public good. When factories run, people work, and when people work, communities thrive. The argument wasn't entirely cynical. Genuine alignment existed between getting business moving and getting people employed. But the framing obscured questions about who benefited most from rapid recovery and who bore the costs of previous underinvestment in resilience. Labour advocates pushed for worker protections and compensation for lost wages, arguing that workers shouldn't bear the cost of weather they didn't cause and couldn't control. The argument had moral force but faced practical obstacles. Companies claimed they couldn't pay for work that didn't happen, that doing so would threaten their viability and thus future employment. The tension between short-term worker needs and long-term business health had no easy resolution. The storm became a case study in disaster capitalism, the way that crisis creates opportunities for some even as it devastates others. Companies specializing in emergency response and reconstruction saw massive demand and corresponding revenue. Suppliers of generators, heaters, and emergency supplies exhausted inventory at premium prices. The market responded to scarcity exactly as economics textbooks predicted, but the human cost of that response troubled people who saw price gouging in what the market called efficient allocation. Hotels that remained operational charged extraordinary rates for rooms, restaurants that could serve food raised their prices, and towing companies demanded premium fees for extraction of stranded vehicles. In each case, the providers justified prices by reference to supply and demand, to their own increased costs, to the value of the service they provided. The explanations were economically rational, but felt morally problematic to people being charged. Government attempts to prevent price gouging faced the usual objections. Price controls reduce supply, create shortages, interfere with markets' natural clearing mechanisms. But the alternative was allowing the storm's costs to fall disproportionately on those least able to pay, concentrating suffering among the already vulnerable. The policy debate replayed arguments as old as markets themselves, with the storm as the latest context for timeless tensions. The rebuilding contracts that followed the storm went predominantly to established companies with existing relationships and capacity to mobilize quickly. Small contractors and new businesses struggled to access opportunities despite competitive pricing, shut out by insurance company preferred provider lists and municipal contracting requirements. The storm's economic aftermath, like the storm itself, reinforced existing structures rather than disrupting them. Some saw in the recovery a chance to reimagine systems, to build resilience rather than just restoring what existed before. Advocates pushed for upgraded power grids, better emergency response systems, stronger building codes, improved communication infrastructure. But the push for improvement ran into the reality of cost. Building better was expensive, and paying for it required either higher taxes or higher prices, both politically challenging in a region that had just absorbed significant economic damage. The tension between rebuilding as was versus rebuilding better played out in countless municipal meetings and state planning sessions. Engineers and planners presented cases for investment in resilience, showing how money spent now could prevent larger losses later. Elected officials weighed those arguments against taxpayer resistance and budget constraints, aware that the political costs of spending would be immediate while the benefits of avoided future disasters were speculative. In the end, most jurisdictions chose restoration over transformation, replacing damaged systems with similar systems rather than fundamentally better ones. The choice was defensible, limited resources needed to address immediate needs first, but it meant that lessons learned wouldn't necessarily translate to lessons implemented. The next comparable storm would likely find much the same vulnerabilities it would have found in 1978. The storm had revealed that economic systems like physical infrastructure were optimized for normal conditions and fragile when conditions deviated from normal. Supply chains designed for efficiency had no redundancy for resilience. Power grids designed for typical loads couldn't handle extreme weather. Transportation networks designed for flow had no capacity for blockage. Each optimization created vulnerability. Each efficiency traded resilience for cost savings. The question the storm posed but didn't answer was whether modern economic arrangements could incorporate resilience without sacrificing the efficiency that made them productive. Could systems be designed to function both normally and under stress? Could redundancy coexist with optimization? The answers weren't clear, but the questions became more urgent as the storm receded and analysis began. For the individuals who lived through it, the economic dimensions were inseparable from the physical experience. The cold you felt was partly determined by the heating system you could afford. The food you ate depended on what you'd stockpiled and could afford to stockpile. The speed of your recovery correlated with your insurance coverage and savings. Class wasn't just about money, but about the material conditions that money purchased, about the buffer between you and catastrophe. The storm demonstrated that equality before nature was an illusion. Everyone faced the same weather, but not everyone faced it from the same position. The wind didn't discriminate, but its effects depended on the quality of your shelter. The cold affected everyone, but its danger depended on your heating options. The isolation was universal, but the resources for dealing with it were not. In the years following, economists would calculate the storm's cost with increasing precision, arriving at figures near or exceeding $1 billion in 1978 currency. The number was useful for comparison and policy discussions, but it couldn't capture the storm's full economic impact, the opportunities missed, the businesses that failed in its aftermath, the lifetime earnings lost by people who died or were disabled, the psychological costs that never appeared in ledgers. The distribution of that cost followed predictable patterns concentrated among those with least capacity to absorb it. The poor spent larger shares of income replacing losses and recovering from disruption. The working class lost more days of wages relative to their earnings. The wealthy experienced inconvenience and some financial impact, but rarely existential threat. The pattern was ancient, visible in every disaster through history. Catastrophe hits hardest where cushions are thinnest. What the storm truly froze wasn't just roads and power lines, but the belief in progress as insulation from nature. The preceding decades had encouraged a confidence that technology and wealth had made civilization fundamentally secure, that disasters were problems for poorer nations and earlier eras. The blizzard of 1978 reminded the Midwest, and through them, the nation, that security was conditional and reversible, that winter could still impose its terms regardless of economic development. The elites who watched from their insulated positions learned, perhaps, that their power had limits they preferred not to acknowledge. The poor who suffered most learned again that society's safety nets were designed for normal times and frayed under stress. Everyone learned that the distance between comfort and crisis was shorter than they'd believed, measured not in miles but in hours without power, in degrees below comfortable temperature, in the rate of fuel consumption versus fuel availability. The storm's economic impact rippled through years of budget discussions and planning processes, influencing everything from insurance requirements to infrastructure investment to emergency management protocols. But the deeper impact was psychological. The recognition that wealth and power could be rendered temporarily meaningless by weather, that the systems supporting modern life were more fragile than their everyday reliability suggested. As the snow melted and commerce resumed its normal flows, as factories reopened and paychecks flowed again, the urgency faded but the knowledge remained. Those who experienced the storm carried a consciousness of fragility, an awareness that the ordinary world's stability was maintained by systems that could fail, by infrastructure that could break, by natural conditions remaining within manageable ranges. The awareness didn't paralyze them. Life continued, adaptations were made, but it colored their sense of security permanently. The frozen economy thawed, as economies always do after disruption, and growth resumed its usual patterns. But for a week in January 1978, the entire economic system of a region had simply stopped, demonstrated that all the sophisticated financial instruments and complex supply chains depended ultimately on roads being passable and power flowing and people being able to reach their work. The revelation was humbling for those who imagined economic systems as autonomous and self-sustaining, independent of physical conditions. The storm proved that nature still had veto power over human plans, that winter could still impose costs that exceeded any reasonable preparation, that the advance of civilization hadn't eliminated fundamental vulnerabilities. The proof was written in snow and ice, in darkened factories and empty streets, in the week when power, economic, political, technological, stopped moving and revealed itself as less substantial than anyone had preferred to believe. And so the great storm passed, as all storms eventually do, leaving behind a landscape transformed and a people changed by the experience of its passing. The snow that had fallen so remorselessly began its slow retreat, melting under a sun that returned with almost apologetic weakness, as if embarrassed by its absence during the crisis. The world didn't snap back to normal. Recovery came in increments, in roads gradually cleared, and power slowly restored in the patient work of rebuilding what the storm had broken. We've drifted together through that week in January 1978, experiencing through imagination and detail what it meant to live through a moment when winter asserted absolute authority over human plans. You've felt perhaps the cold that penetrated even the best defenses, the isolation that came when familiar landmarks disappeared beneath white, the strange mixture of fear and resignation that accompanied watching civilization's supports fail one by one. The people who endured that storm emerged from it subtly changed, marked by the experience in ways both obvious and invisible. They knew something that those who only read about it could never quite grasp. They knew what it felt like when modern comfort revealed itself as temporary and conditional, when the distance between security and survival collapsed to nothing, when nature demonstrated its continuing power despite all human attempts at dominance. But there's something else worth carrying from this journey into the past, something beyond the specific details of that particular storm. The blizzard of 1978 was extraordinary, yes, historic in its intensity, exceptional in its impact, but also representative of something eternal and recurring. Every generation faces its reminders that human control is partial and provisional, that the natural world retains capacities beyond our management. The storm taught lessons about preparation and resilience, about the importance of community and the value of maintaining systems with redundancy rather than optimizing them purely for efficiency. These lessons were learned, then gradually forgotten as the immediate threat receded, then remembered when the next disaster arrived. The cycle is older than memory, this pattern of crisis and response, learning and forgetting, confidence and humility. Tonight, as you rest in whatever comfort you've created for yourself, you might spare a thought for the contrast between your present moment and that frozen week we've explored together. You have heat that flows at the adjustment of a thermostat, light that appears at the flick of a switch, food that arrived at your local store through supply chains of bewildering complexity. These conveniences are so reliable that they become invisible, noticed only when they fail. The people of 1978 took these same conveniences for granted until the storm stripped them away and revealed the infrastructure beneath daily life. In your own life, that infrastructure remains mostly hidden, functioning quietly behind the scenes, maintaining the temperature and light and connection that you experience as simply normal. The blizzard reminds us to notice what we normally overlook, to appreciate systems that work, and to understand their fragility. Perhaps you're listening to this from a place of warmth and safety, your own small refuge against whatever weather exists outside your walls. Perhaps it's winter where you are, or perhaps the seasons have turned and summer heat presses against your windows instead of cold. Wherever you are, whatever season surrounds you, you exist in a moment that the people of January 1978 would have recognized. Human consciousness sheltered inside structures we've built, hoping they're sufficient against what nature might bring. The storm is over now, ended decades ago. Its snow long melted into soil and rivers and the cycling waters that sustain all life. The people who lived through it have grown older, their children have had children. The world has turned through seasons uncounted since that frozen week. But the memory persists, carried in stories and photographs, in the way survivors' eyes change when they talk about it, in the cautious respect for winter weather that marks anyone who experienced that January. You might find yourself thinking about your own preparations, your own readiness for whatever disruptions might come. The lesson isn't to live in fear. The storm was rare, and most winters pass without such drama, but to maintain a consciousness of possibility, an awareness that the ordinary can become extraordinary with surprising speed. Keep your supplies reasonable, your contingencies sensible, your respect for natural forces humble and alert. As you drift towards sleep now, let the story of the storm remind you of something comforting in its way. That humans are remarkably resilient, that communities pull together when crisis demands it, that people discover capacities they didn't know they possessed when circumstances require discovery. The storm was terrible, yes, but also clarifying, revealing both vulnerability and strength in the same frozen moment. The houses that sheltered families during that week stand mostly still, their walls having proved adequate to the test that winter imposed. The roads that became impassable were cleared eventually and carry traffic still. The power lines that failed were repaired and hum with current flowing to millions of homes. The infrastructure held, bent but not broken, and life resumed its usual patterns after the extraordinary week ended. Let yourself feel grateful for the ordinary comforts that surround you, the bed beneath you, the roof above you, the heat that maintains livable temperatures without conscious effort on your part. These comforts are achievements, the product of countless human efforts across generations, infrastructure built and maintained by people you'll never meet, but whose work supports your daily existence. The storm revealed how much we depend on these hidden systems, how quickly life becomes difficult when they fail. But also feel confident in your own capacity to endure, to adapt, to survive what comes. The people of 1978 weren't superhuman. They were ordinary individuals who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and did what was necessary. You possess the same fundamental capabilities, the same capacity for resilience under pressure. The knowledge might never be tested, and we can hope it won't be, but it's there nonetheless, dormant but available. The snow of January 1978 has melted into history now, become story and statistic, memory and lesson. The storm itself has dissolved into the atmosphere it came from, its water molecules cycling through clouds and rain, through rivers and oceans, through the vast planetary systems that generate weather and climate. Nothing of the storm remains in physical form except its effect. The buildings it damaged, the lives it changed, the memories it created in those who experienced it. And yet, in another sense, the storm persists, in the consciousness of vulnerability it created, in the policy changes it prompted, in the stories told and retold through the years that followed. History isn't just what happened, but what we remember and how we remember it, the narratives we construct from events and the meanings we extract from them. The blizzard lives in that space between fact and interpretation, between event and significance. As your eyes grow heavy and your breathing slows, as your mind releases its grip on consciousness and drifts towards sleep, carry with you this final thought that every age faces its challenges, every generation its storms, and every individual their moments of testing. The form changes, but the fundamental human situation remains constant. We are fragile creatures in a powerful world, ingenious and adaptable but never entirely secure, always dependent on systems and forces beyond complete control. The people of 1978 survived their storm and went on to live their lives, to raise families and pursue dreams, to experience joys and sorrows that had nothing to do with winter weather. The storm was 1 week in lifetimes that spanned decades, significant but not defining, memorable but not imprisoning. They carried its lessons without being paralyzed by them, respected winter without fearing it, prepared sensibly without becoming paranoid. This is perhaps the deepest lesson, that we can acknowledge vulnerability without surrendering to anxiety, can respect nature's power without being terrorized by it, can prepare intelligently while still trusting that most days will be ordinary. The storm was exceptional, but exceptions by definition don't define the normal. Most winters pass without catastrophic blizzards, most days without crisis, most moments in relative peace. Sleep now, if sleep will come, and let the story of the storm fade into the general drift of historical awareness that consciousness carries. You've traveled back to January 1978 and experienced, through detail and imagination, what that frozen week felt like. You've walked through the cold, felt the isolation, understood the fear and the strange beauty of a world remade in white. Tomorrow you'll wake to your own time, your own place, your own season and weather. The storm will recede into memory, this story, into the general background of things you've learned. But perhaps you'll carry forward some small appreciation for the comfort you have, some modest gratitude for the systems that support your daily life, some quiet respect for winter's continuing power, despite all our technological advances. The rhythm of your breath grows slower now, the weight of your body settles more deeply into rest. Outside your window, whatever weather exists continues its eternal patterns. Wind and temperature, pressure and precipitation, the great atmospheric machinery that generates the climate we live within. Sometimes that machinery produces gentle rain and pleasant breezes, sometimes extraordinary events that remind us of its power. The storm is over. The snow has melted. The people have recovered. Life continues its complex unfolding, carrying forward the lessons learned and gradually forgetting them, until the next reminder arrives and the cycle begins again. This is how history works, how humanity persists through crisis and recovery, disaster and rebuilding, fear and eventual comfort. Rest now in the knowledge that you are safe in this moment, that the storm we've explored together is long past, that the lessons it taught have been learned by those who needed to learn them. Rest in the comfort of your present situation, the warmth of your shelter, the peace of this particular night. Let the story of that frozen week drift away like snow melting into spring soil, nourishing memory, but not disturbing sleep. The world spins through darkness toward another dawn, carrying you with it, and somewhere in the turning all the storms that have been, and all that will be, exist only as possibility, as memory, as story. Tonight's story is ended. The journey is complete. The past releases you back to your present. Sleep well, dream gently, and wake to whatever weather tomorrow brings, ready to face it with the resilience that humans have always possessed, the adaptability that has carried our species through every storm that nature has sent. Good night.